I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, who is Roger Lewis, architect and professor emeritus at the University of Maryland, author and journalist, and well-known cartoon chronicler, I'm not sure if that's a word, but I made it up, of real estate events and trends in the Washington metropolitan area. As with many of our speakers and attendees this weekend, he has a vigorous bio, which is in your program, and I refer you to that. As moderators, we have taken a solemn oath that we will not be spending hours of your precious time this weekend reciting bios. However, it is worth it to mention a few items about Mr. Lewis. First and foremost, Roger Lewis was in attendance at the original charette so many moons ago, and the famous cartoon that adorns our program, and is behind me, good, and has been a bit of a theme for this weekend's activities, was his product. Many of you have seen it, I'm sure. The phraseology on the cartoon, quote, "terrific plan, some of my ideas are there," end quote, captured the essence of that new concept in 1988, the charette. Empowering and including stakeholders became a mantra for all of us in the planning profession, and it remains with us to this day. It's a remarkably valuable idea in a civic-driven community like Montgomery County. Roger has continued the tradition and has honored all of us here this weekend by producing a follow-up cartoon to his 25-year-old gem, and here it is. And with it, I present to you Roger Lewis.
Thank you. Are we going to... Thank you very much for inviting me to come out here. It has been a long while since I was here. Thank you. I want to thank whoever was responsible for the weather. It's fabulous. Montgomery County, thank you. Gaithersburg weather. And I'm gonna run through these slides fairly quickly. I always like to put L'Enfant's plan of Washington up because the point it makes, as does this image that I drew for a column about town planning. This is kind of a representation of Savannah, Georgia. Some of you may have been to Savannah, Georgia, which I think is still one of the most fabulous places that's been planned in the last 300 years in the United States. My point is that we used to know how to make towns and settlements that were walkable, that were pleasant to be in, that were not necessarily driven or inspired solely by accommodation of the automobile. However, there were people even then, and certainly there have been a lot more since then, who weren't sure about living in cities or towns that had plans that looked a little bit like the one you see in this image, or just preferred to stick with the American tradition of living in, in an agrarian environment or in agrarian culture. The result was, particularly after World War II, to some extent before World War II, but after World War II, planners essentially, you probably can't read that. No, you can't read that. They're arguing about what colors to use to make this map that you'll see here, to separate uses, to worry very little about the pattern of streetscapes, to not at all worry about the making of civic spaces. And I have my own mea culpa. You see this land use plan. This is Churchill Town sector in Germantown, Maryland. Any of you hear of Germantown? Yeah. I actually, early in my career, my firm did a lot of the planning for that. So I have to confess, though, that in 1970, 71, 72, when we made these plans, we were still thinking this way. And this is captured to some extent in this cartoon, which actually didn't appear in the Washington Post. This is a cartoon that was in the Growth Management Handbook. Growth management was also a term like neo-traditional planning. It's the term that preceded smart growth. And this was an attempt to show what had happened in suburban America. You see these, you can't see the notes, but up at the top of that slide it says conceptual walls of enclosure and separation. You see a lot of cul-de-sacs. You see what is a kind of development, a kind of sprawl that in fact was typical from coast to coast. This was throughout America. The result, again, of zoning and of an attitude about how we should use the landscape. Not only that, there were certain, as this slide suggests, templates for how to make development, how to build housing, and there hadn't been much thinking about the alternatives to these standard templates. And along came the careers, and I think we need to mention the importance of the influence of Leon Creer and his brother Rob Creer. These are excerpts from a publication, and I don't remember the exact dates. There are some people here who probably remember the dates when these were first drawn and published. But they're showing something very important that began to inform Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk and Andres Duany and others about a new way of thinking about how to make suburban developments or developments anywhere, which was that instead of just thinking about two-dimensional, multicolored land use maps, we could instead start thinking about streets, about the public realm, about public space, and about making our planning driven by the creation of spaces that were not just suited to automobiles, but were also very much oriented toward pedestrians. And the Creer drawings, as you can see, in addition to streets, they were all about making civic spaces. They were about doing things that you will not find. If you go look at any zoning ordinance or code prior to the 1980s, you will not find anything in the codes or the zoning ordinances or regulations anywhere in this country that talk about the public realm, about making urban space or suburban space for that matter. One of the, I suppose the poster child for me when I started writing for the Post was Tyson's. Used to be called Tyson's Corner. They renamed it Tyson's. And this cartoon, which I did, oh gosh, I think I drew this about 1986, the old rules and the new rules. This was when we were beginning to suggest to people that the old rules really weren't working to give us the kinds of environments we wanted. Now, if you look you can't read it, but this image on the left shows a bunch of zones, separate zones. There's the light industrial zone, the battle zone, the townhouse zone, the twilight zone, the strike zone down at the bottom, as opposed to the new rules on the right, which are showing something very different. They're showing something about the form that one might want in creating a place, whether it's urban or suburban. Probably one of my most, cartoon I use more than almost any other when I give talks about this. The woman is saying, take your choice, grapevines or grid lines. I sometimes refer to the image on the left as varicose vein street planning. But this was one of the things, that I think we all began to think about pretty seriously in the 70s and 80s, which is that this plan on the left, the grapevines, is doomed to fail as soon as anything goes wrong with the arterial that you see all these things leading into. There was something fundamentally flawed about this approach to design, of designing suburban communities, as opposed to the plan on the right, which is made up. That's not any particular place. I just made that up. But the notion of that is it shows a network of interconnected streets where if you're at point A, there might be 3 or 4 ways to get to point B. This is very important because I think it's one of the fundamental principles of new urbanism, is to make places that work in terms of circulation and movement, more like the image on the right than the image on the left. So I started preaching, as did Elizabeth and Andres and others, that we needed to dump in the trash. We needed to get rid of some of these codes. We needed to come up with something new, a new set of codes and regulations. And the reason that was important is that, in fact, as long as we had these existing regulations and these existing codes, it was going to be difficult to implement, to do something like Kentlands. And along came Seaside. Some of you have probably heard about it. Maybe some of you have been there. I had the pleasure of going down to Florida and seeing it. I drew this cartoon. It's really to illustrate a piece I wrote about a code, creating a new kind of code. I couldn't resist. I think this is hanging on somebody's wall down in Florida. You probably can't read it, but the guy, those of you in back, the fellow with the Seaside shirt on is saying, "Hi, and welcome to Seaside. I see you know the code." And the fellow responding, "Sure do. We've just finished building the porch, tower, and picket fence. Next year we'll add the house." Now, I was making fun of this, and I think Robert Davis took it in good spirits. But one of the things that was so fabulous about Seaside is it really was a prototype, illustrating, even though it was essentially a second home community, illustrating how some of these traditional principles could be applied to make a place where you could walk. So now take a look at this image. This is a more recent cartoon about walkability. And one of the primary goals of neo-traditional planning and subsequently new urbanism was to make places that you could walk and you didn't have to get in a car. I was just in Houston. I have to confess I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. You couldn't find a less new urbanist city than Houston. No zoning. They're trying to make for the first time a plan. Is something going wrong? Are we on fire? Okay. And Houston, I was visiting my sister down there, and I remember when, just to go buy a yogurt, we got in the car, we drove 7 miles on a freeway to get to a place to buy some frozen yogurt, which wasn't bad. But the notion of walking in Houston doesn't exist. So anyway, that's a very important component to which we've also added biking. And some of you who know Washington probably know that now that there are bike lanes proliferating throughout the city that were not there 10 years ago, and more people are riding bikes. In certain streets you take your life in your hands, but it's become very, very popular. So what we have is a transformation, and this is where Kentlands comes in. Let me make my assertion in answer to the question that was asked about the impact. I would say that the Kentlands' greatest impact, its greatest influence, has been not that it has spawned replications of Kentlands. You can't drive around metropolitan Washington and find 30 Kentlands. But what Kentlands did, though, is it illustrated the amenity and the quality and the benefits of new urbanist planning and the application of new urbanist principles. And that's what we're going to talk about for a couple more minutes. By the way, another very important aspect, another thing that we all are very aware of is that I think has been strongly supported by and advocated by the new urbanists and people who are not new urbanists is transit-oriented development. There's always a skeptic or two. The guy on the right is saying, if you ask me, it means tons of density. We're still fighting these battles, by the way. There's still a lot of people who are skeptical. The effect, let's call it the Kentlands effect, has been that a lot of people in the last 25 years, people who are in planning agencies throughout this region, political officials throughout this region, real estate developers throughout this region, and architects throughout this region, without necessarily putting it up on their door, in fact, have embraced and are applying new urbanist principles. For example, at Tyson's Corner, or Tyson's, they're dropping the corner. At Tyson's, the new plan for Tyson's, 1,700 acres, envisions imposing a completely new street grid block pattern on Tyson's. It's going to be not easy to do. You can see the woman on the right saying, after he says, we simply superimpose this grid, she says, simply? I don't think so. It will be very challenging, but they're going to do it. We're seeing retrofitting happening. We know that one of the things that you can see as evidence of this that's suggested in this slide is along Wisconsin Avenue north of Georgetown. Torty Gallus designed a Safeway store after they demolished the old one, and instead of the usual pattern of parking in front and the store behind, the store is in front and the parking is under the store and behind the store. I mean, there are a lot of gestures, there are a lot of things you can find now in Washington region where you can immediately see the consequence of new urbanist thinking and new urbanist understanding affecting the form and character of urban or urbanizing or suburban environments. I want to show you one example. Columbia, Maryland. I hope you can see this image. My shadow is in the way, but this is an aerial photo of the downtown Columbia, Maryland. Columbia, Maryland was planned in the 60s. It was a plan developed by James Rouse that envisioned a number of villages. It wasn't a stupid plan, but it was still primarily an aggregation of conventionally planned suburban subdivisions in orbit around the downtown, quote unquote, which was essentially a shopping center. Can you see that? And that shopping center was fairly successful. I mean, it was an economic decision, of course. The shopping center was something that they felt they could build very early on, and that would help catalyze interest and development in the rest of the community. In 1989, I was asked by the editors of Columbia magazine to write a critique of Columbia, which I did. And for that critique, I drew a cartoon. This is 1989, in which I suggested, this is the same year that we had, that you're celebrating tonight, 89, 25 years ago. I drew this cartoon in 1989, and it shows that mall in Columbia with some additional roads. I've superimposed a grid of streets and some blocks and showed some buildings. About 4 years ago, downtown Columbia was acquired excuse me, by General Growth Properties, and they hired Cooper Robertson in New York and Sasaki as the landscape architect to do a plan for downtown Columbia. Now look at this plan. Let me go back. Look at that. That's a cartoon I drew in '89. This is the plan generated in about 2005 or 6. Maybe 7. I don't want to get the year wrong, so I'm just going to say it was the second half of the first decade of the 2000s. And this is the plan that was adopted for downtown Columbia. All the surface parking is gone. You see a grid of streets. You see, again, it's not Kentlands. It's not replicating Kentlands, but it is applying some of the same principles we've been talking about. And more recently, again, I did an article about that showing exactly what they have in mind. Eventually, they're going to slice up the mall. The plan is to slice up the mall. This plan, by the way, density, which is not necessarily something that Kentlands has a whole lot of. I mean, it's not a terribly dense community, but this makeover of downtown Columbia is going to be quite dense. There are going to be 5,500 new dwelling units, 1 million square feet of office space, and another 1 million square feet of retail, and a whole lot of other stuff that I don't need to identify for you. But it's again, it's about density, it's about mixed use, it's about creating a network of streets and public spaces that, I'm going the wrong way, such as this. This is called Market Square. This is hypothetical. This hasn't really been designed. But again, it shows you a complete change in thinking. This is totally different thinking about planning from James Rouse's planning of the 1960s. Another piece of evidence, if you will, about the influence of the Kentlands effect. A few years ago in Reston Town Center, if some of you know Reston Town Center, you know that too is a grid with blocks and sidewalks, and it's very dense. Well, next to that, you can see in the upper left, you see that says, there's a part of that drawing that says Town Center and another one that says Spectrum Center. There was a proposal to build Spectrum Center, a low-rise, fairly low-density aggregation of shops and stores. And get this, some of you may have read this, the people in Reston opposed the Spectrum Center because it was not dense enough. Not dense enough. So you can see the guy asking, aren't we usually in favor of doing the opposite? They're all advocating taller buildings, higher density, pedestrian-oriented, pedestrian-friendly streets, urbanity, more land uses. It's an amazing moment. Even more amazing is just a few years ago, the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia, not the most progressive state in the nation. To show you how far we've gotten, how much Kentlands, if you will, the Kentlands effect, the new urbanist thinking has gotten. The state of Virginia passed ordinances empowering VDOT, the Virginia Department of Transportation, to start requiring that in new subdivisions, streets must be interconnected to adjacent subdivisions, and that cul-de-sacs are to be discouraged. Now that's the state of Virginia. And I remember when that, again, I couldn't resist writing about that. It was shocking, but in Virginia now, cul-de-sacs are déclassé. Crown. There's a Crown somewhere here. I don't know if it's been built, but I remember reading about it, and I couldn't help, when I read about it, it seemed to me that they had obviously, whoever planned it, I can't remember who it was, they may be here, must have read the New Urbanism Bible, because it seemed to me that it was very much about making an urbanized kind of community here in suburban Gaithersburg. So I want to leave you with this thought. What you have done, what Kentlands has done, is it has shown both the aesthetic and the economic viability of a new urbanist approach to making new suburban, or for that matter, urban communities. And thank you for listening to this after dinner.